So my background is in emergency medicine and high altitude medicine. I've been doing both for about 40 years. Did special training in high altitude medicine at University of Colorado. And I've always been attracted to the mountains, living in the mountains, playing in the mountains, and always interested in the effect of high altitude on human physiology and health. I started as a climber and as a trekker, became interested in high altitude medicine right out of training. My first job was as a helicopter rescue doctor in Yosemite. And from there I went to Nepal and helped to start the Himalayan Rescue Association, where I lived for 6 years at 14,000 feet, doing research, taking care of sick trekkers, climbers, and locals. And that took me into my own research lab on Mount McKinley or Denali in Alaska at 14,000 feet, and research projects in Tibet, South America, China, Alaska. I've been all over the world, all the mountain ranges, to all the places where high altitude peoples live and where lowlanders go to recreate or work at high altitudes, like high altitude mines and telescopes. So I've been very actively involved and got in on the ground level, so to speak, about 40 years ago when the field was just starting. High altitude has a significant effect on both metabolic rate and appetite, which is why people who live at altitude tend to be thinner, and which is why high altitude can actually be used to lose weight. At the very high altitudes, it's a big problem in climbers who lose too much weight and too much muscle mass. So basic metabolic rate is increased because of the hypoxia or lack of oxygen. At the same time, appetite is suppressed, and there's a switch in metabolism between the fatty acid metabolism and carbohydrate metabolism. The net result is that the high altitude environment, or simulated high altitude environment, produces changes in body fat, muscle structure, lean muscle mass, total body weight, and total body water. The greater the altitude stress, the higher the altitude, in other words, the more likely these changes take place. There seems to be a threat. This isn't very well studied, this particular aspect, but at around 7,000 or 8,000 feet is where this change in metabolism and appetite takes place. And the higher you go, the greater those changes. But you need to be at least 7,000 or 8,000 feet for most people. And duration at altitude also makes an issue. The longer you live at high altitude, the more your metabolism is going to be changed. Your weight may be stabilized at a lower weight over a period of time. There's some evidence that if you go to altitude, say 8,000 feet for just a week or so, your body will start to acclimatize to the point that your appetite won't be suppressed anymore and your metabolism won't change so much. But that's not entirely clear. There's also some differences in gender. Men seem to be more impacted by these changes than women. Doesn't seem to be any definite influence on age. We're assuming we're talking about healthy people that are going to lose weight. There's evidence that if you're overweight, to begin with, you're going to lose more weight. There's also evidence that if you have metabolic syndrome, which is overweight, glucose intolerance, or near diabetes and hypertension, that altitude exposure can be beneficial for the entire syndrome. So the altitude is important, and the duration at altitude is important for all these changes. It might be surprising to think that this technique actually works when you're only in the simulated altitude exposure for 7 or 8 hours a night. What about the other 16, 17 hours a day? Well, that's why the simulated devices aren't quite as good as actually living at high altitude, but it's impressive that even 7 or 8 hours a day of exposure will produce these benefits of increased metabolic rate and a decreased appetite. It seems to last throughout the day. So the hypoxic exposure has effects that goes beyond the number of hours you actually spend at simulated altitude. It's one of the fascinating areas of research in this whole subject. So how much weight could you expect to lose with one of these hypoxic devices? It depends on a number of factors. It depends on the degree of hypoxia or how high the simulated altitude is, your genetics, your gender, your physical condition, and other medical conditions. One study done in Germany with 20 obese people lost an average of 1 pound a week for the duration of the study. And that might be a reasonable goal to shoot for, but there has to be a fair amount of flexibility in your expectations because it really depends on a number of factors. But a pound a week would be a good ballpark figure to shoot for. So you would think that if altitude suppresses appetite and increases metabolism, everyone in Colorado would be skinny. Well, in fact, Colorado is the leanest state in the country. The obesity rate in Colorado is growing, but it's still about 22%, whereas the national average is 42%. And it's the only state with under 25% obesity rate. Not only that, but if you stratify Colorado by altitude, the people in the very highest counties are the most slender, or I should say the least obese. And you can see that in multiple studies even around the world, that there's an altitude gradation effect. The higher the altitude, the less obesity. The reasons for it aren't entirely clear. We talked about increase in metabolism, decrease in appetite. Those are the most important. But also people that live in these communities tend to take better care of themselves. They tend to go outdoors more. They tend to exercise more. And there's very good evidence that if you really want to try to use high altitude for losing weight, the best thing to do is to combine it with exercise as well. You may have heard of elite athletes using these altitude simulation devices or tents, and they all do. All the aerobic athletes, all the Olympic athletes use them. They use it for a different purpose because they stimulate more red blood cell production, which is basically like blood doping. The more red cells, you can improve your performance at lower altitude. You may not have heard, though, about using these devices for weight loss because it's such a new phenomenon. Only in the last few years has it really been studied for that purpose. But you're going to be hearing more and more about it. It's safe. It's effective. There's no real side effects like there is with medications. And let's face it, obesity is a huge problem in our country and around the world without much in the way of effective therapy. So there's certainly a role for hypoxic devices for simulating altitude in order to lose weight and for more research in this area. Sure, you can have other people sleep in the tent with you, but if they're not acclimatized, if they haven't been adjusting to it over a period of time, they might get a headache or have a poor night's sleep. So ideally, anybody that wants to sleep with you in that tent should have a gradual exposure and gradually increasing the altitude, just like you're going to do. Dogs and pets can do it also. Dogs can feel the altitude and they can sometimes get a little lethargic, act a little bit sick, but they also adjust very quickly. Simulated altitude and actual altitude are a little bit different. Actual altitude is a little more stressful on the body. It induces more physiologic changes than simulated altitude. So for simulated altitude, you You don't change the pressure, you just change the concentration of oxygen in the air. So you add nitrogen, and that reduces the oxygen level, and that's the same as going up in altitude in terms of the amount of oxygen available to the body. Obviously, simulated altitude has a lot of advantages. You don't have to travel. You can do it at home if you have a small tent device or deoxygenated room, for example. And you can go in and out. There's no chamber locks, so there's no change in pressure. It's much simpler than having an actual altitude chamber. What if you have to get out of the room or the tent at night, say to go to the bathroom, and go back in? So you might be going from 12,000 feet down to sea level and then back in the device at 12,000 feet. You might expect that to have some detrimental effects, but it seems to work out pretty well. Again, there's no change in pressure, there's only the change in the oxygen concentration, but the body tolerates that very well since you've been sleeping at 10 or 12,000 feet simulated altitude for a number of days. So going out for a brief period of time and coming back in is not going to make much difference. It'd be the same as putting on an oxygen mask for a few minutes and then taking it off again. And one doesn't have to worry too much about the effects on the body of going back and forth like that. So like any therapeutic advance in medicine, there's indications and contraindications, or what we call relative contraindications. So before someone is going to use a hypoxic device to simulate altitude in order to lose weight or improve physical performance, they really ought to be cleared by their physician to make sure they don't have any issues that could come up or could be aggravated because of the low oxygen exposure. For example, blood pressure that's under poor control, it would be a relative contraindication. People who have sleep apnea and have to use a CPAP device or oxygen during sleep obviously are not candidates for this kind of treatment. But most people who are healthy but otherwise, who are overweight but otherwise healthy can do okay. Diabetes is not an issue. Lung disease could be an issue. And so you want to check with your doctor if you have lung disease before going to a simulated altitude. There aren't many contraindications to the use of these kind of devices, but lung disease, heart disease, poorly controlled blood pressure, maybe seizure disorder, a few neurologic conditions. Overall, it's a good idea to check with your doctor before using these kind of devices or contacting a high altitude medicine specialist.